Today, we build the magic shop. This was a huge step because the village has all of the most complex builds in it. And this is a video series, so if you want to see it from the beginning, there's a link below. Just like every other build in this game, we started with brainstorming on the whiteboard. The original village had been mapped out nearly 18 months earlier. We had gained some experience from crafting the rock world and the forest world, and we'd locked down the story of the game. There was no question we were going to have medieval-style buildings, and one of the biggest and baddest was the magic shop. The first thing we did was make a paper mock-up that was supposed to be half-scale, but actually ended up being about quarter-scale because we made all of our pieces much, much bigger. We knew for sure that we wanted it to be a nice two-story building with a corner bend in it. The paper version was made for our cardboard mock-ups. There's more on that in previous videos, which you can find in the links below. Because we had limited space on the table, we used cutout paper bases as placeholders and moved them around on the table until we could find a way to fit everything.
I spent a lot of time researching buildings, props, and techniques on Pinterest. There was a ruined building layout I saw in a few places that was adapted by various crafters, and I thought it was super close to what we had planned. So I decided to use it as the inspiration for our magic shop. As this was the first complex building we were working on, it was important to plan it properly. I started with a few sketches to finalize the blueprint.
Before jumping right into the real foam version, we decided to make a full-sized cardboard version. Making this mock-up allowed us to see if our measuring techniques were right, and the cardboard sections would serve as templates for cutting out the foam pieces later on. The central character in the village is a lizard man with limited magical powers. We used a green Slad from D&D as our lizard wizard. He has a kind of sad life story and has been trying to increase his magic power and try to put things right in the village after a life-changing encounter with the professor, our main antagonist. For this build, the floors would be made out of wooden stir sticks, and we planned to use the cardboard cutout as a guide for the size and shape of the floor. We used the painter's tape to hold everything in place so that then we could break down the entire cardboard piece back down to its component parts once we saw if the measurements were right. The roof required some brushing up on old geometry skills and remembering all the fancy shapes like rhombuses, trapezoids, and parallelograms. This cardboard build came out looking great. We whipped out our knives and cracked into some XPS foam to make a base for the magic shop. The base was about 9 by 11 inches. We used our hot wire cutter to shape the base because it's far easier to work with than a knife. You just get way cleaner cuts, especially on thick foam pieces. When we made the rock and forest worlds, we crafted bases that matched for all of the dioramas in the worlds. Jagged stone for the rock world, and dirt and grass for the forest world. So we decided to do something similar for the village. We made matching piled stone bases by drawing up the pattern with a pencil and then digging out chunks with a knife.
The cheapest tool in our toolkit is a rock from our garden. I used this rock to texture foam to make it look more like rocks. I prefer it over the tinfoil ball as it hurts my hand when rolling it around. Using a blunt pencil, I drew large stone slabs for the ground floor of the magic shop. I made the shapes curved and irregular and arranged them as if I was building a puzzle. I did that for the entire base as the shop was going to take all the space. I have this awesome sculpting toolkit with all sorts of great tools. And I don't only use it for polymer clay. I used a couple of these tools to bevel the edges of the stones. I used the ball stylus and a pointy but blunt metal tool over all the lines I drew. And of course, I finished the look using a rock for texturing this entire floor. I can say that I used this technique for every single thing I did in the village, and this might be my favorite base.
And as we mentioned before, we did not have a foam cutting bench, and the 2-inch thick foam was way too thick to cut walls out of. So we got some thin sheets of XPS foam from Game Master, the XPS Scenery Foam Booster Pack. And now that we had a base and some material for walls, we broke down the cardboard mock-up to use the pieces as templates for cutting the foam. It was a bit of a puzzle finding the best way to cut out all of the pieces, so as not to waste the limited XPS foam. We figured out how to make the magic shop with just 2 sheets of foam, and we're pretty proud of that. This foam cuts really well in one direction, and a little bit more roughly in the other. It's extruded so it has a kind of grain, almost like wood. The magic shop has a huge open side that lets you see into the building, so we had to cut out the windows. We couldn't just place a window frame on the wall like you sometimes see when people make dioramas. We started with the walls on the first floor, cutting out the jagged pattern of broken walls with a utility knife. We used round-headed needles to temporarily hold the walls in place. We did this to see if the cuts worked before gluing everything in place.
The next step was to build the floor using wooden stir sticks and some nice big tongue depressors, but I also used some classic popsicle sticks. And then I used bamboo skewers as a key element. And as I have no patience for waiting for glue to dry, I used hot glue. Gardeners would cringe, but I also used my beautiful pruning shears. I was off to the races to start figuring out how I would build these floors. I tried a few different techniques, starting with one where I had the sticks glued to the support frame first and then clipping them to size. I had to figure out what would be the best way to create the support structure, especially because it would be visible. I tried a different way using painter's tapes to hold the sticks together and then cutting them to size using the pruning shears. This first floor was built using many different techniques and it allowed me to learn what would work best. Thankfully, I got better over time, because there is a ton of woodwork, floors, and roofs in the village. I grabbed our steel wire brushes for texturing, and I brushed all the floors to give them a more prominent texture and damage. But I found that it was not obvious enough, so I used a utility knife to create bigger grooves. At this point, it looked more like a cool taco shop than a medieval magic shop, but it was really coming together well.
We mapped out the lines and started cutting the walls for the second floor. There were a lot more walls to cut compared to the basic 4 walls on the first floor. The shapes were a lot more intricate than the bottom floor with quite a few fancy angles. The best scenario when working with foam is using a hot wire cutter and a bench hot wire cutter, and avoid using knives altogether, but we didn't have the bench hot wire cutter, so straight lines were still best with a knife. As we mentioned, the foam cuts really well in one direction, but it's a little rough in the other, so we needed sanding paper to smooth out the rough spots. An awesome tool was this mini vacuum from Woodland Scenics. It's for sucking up static grass and flocking and other bits of terrain that might get scattered around your work area, but it was great for cleaning up the foam bits as well. Just as with the first floor, we used pins to hold the walls in place to see how well they fit together. And for the cracked up, broken down wooden floor, we ended up adding some tongue depressors and popsicle sticks underneath it and around the edges, which made it look a lot more finished and not like we just glued coffee stir sticks together. It wasn't easy to pin all the walls in place because there were so many small angles to deal with, but with some patience, it got done and it was already starting to look pretty good. And for the first building we'd crafted, things were going a lot better than expected.
For the roof structure, I used wooden dowels because the pieces are really long and need to be sturdy. This is where I pulled my non-existent carpentry degree to figure out how to build this 8-piece roof. I placed the dowels and the skewers on the template to envision the skeleton. This became pretty much like building real walls, except that the last time I built a real wall, I was a kid and I was helping my dad finishing our basement. And this is where I started massacring my beautiful cutting mat. I used the measuring guides on the mat to build my frame to make sure everything was straight. The same way as when you're building a wall, I put evenly spaced support pieces inside the frame, except that I use skewers instead of 2x4s. From this point onward, I started cutting the sticks to size before gluing them. I did work a lot with my dad on construction and mechanics projects while growing up, and I feel that a lot of the things he taught me helped me make sense of this. Thank you, Dad. I covered the entire exterior of the roof with stir sticks. I was so pleased when I put these 2 pieces together. The first floor was improvised and glued in a bit of a mishmash, but these look clean, intentional, and wood just looks good. This is a long process and blister-inducing, especially the process of cleaning the hot glue along the skewers, but it's super satisfying. I'm still absolutely baffled that I did not mess up the math or the geometry on this roof and that it came together as if I knew what I was doing. I added another wooden dowel for extra strength. I only learned about balsa wood way later. These are all sticks from the dollar store, so it's rather heavy. I connected the last piece of the main roof section, and seriously, I just enjoy staring at it. The real test was to see if it would fit as expected on the building, because otherwise I would have to restart everything. And it did, but of course I was checking it along the way. From the rock portal, which was roughly sculpted in one single piece of foam, to this, I'm not even sure how I managed this giant leap forward. Bricks, bricks, bricks. This is a taste of the things to come for the village. The first floor of the magic shop is built from stones that villagers found in the neighboring fields and hills. I used the very well-known technique of drawing 1,000,000 bricks with a pencil. It was early in the morning and I did not feel like making a bunch of noise and setting up our folding table, so I worked on the floor. I love working on the floor, and you will see that a few more times in this series. As the walls were visible on both sides, I had to draw bricks on both sides. My friend the rock once again. I pressed and rolled the rock on all the walls to weather and texture the brick. I remember being super focused that day. I was on vacation and I just powered through a huge chunk of the build. I also created a brick column as a means to pass a wire to the second floor and have a light turn on. It doesn't support anything. I saw that in the Pinterest model and I thought it was a good way to hide the wire. I drew a series of stones for the balcony, and I used the same technique as the ground floor, tracing all the stones with the modeling tools. The small ball stylus works rather well. It takes a while, but it produces a more realistic look than if I was just using the pencil. It makes the stones stand out and look rounded. Once again, I textured it with the rock, and I was very pleased with the result. I went from a carpenter to a cabinet maker. I used a couple of tongue depressors that had a nice wood pattern to start making the counter. I scaled it up to the size of the lizard men and not the adventurers. Again, not patient enough to wait for wood glue, so I used hot glue. I probably should have used wood glue, but that will be for another project. The tongue depressors have a convenient size, so I also use them for the sides of the counter. Don't look inside the counter too closely, cause it's just a party of glue. But no one will ever know, as it will be trapped inside and will not be visible from any direction. I cut smaller pieces to size to cap the ends of the counter. All in all, pretty good for my first piece of furniture. Now the shop is ready to receive magical articles to sell to our adventurers.
We've finally reached the point of hot gluing the walls of the first floor down to the base. And as always, it's important to use the low heat setting on your hot glue gun if you're hot gluing foam, or else it could melt your pieces. For this part of the build, we remembered to put it on low, but it is possible to forget or have the switch get flicked to high by accident. Not that it would ever happen to us, because we are careful, safe crafters. It's definitely not like later on hot glue will melt some of our pieces. Spoiler alert, it's totally gonna happen. So far for the walls, mostly everything was looking pretty good. The 45-degree angles were a little bit janky in the corners, but, and they didn't come out perfectly, but it wasn't the end of the world. The reason we were not too worried on this build was because we were planning to cover them with some foam cornerstones. We tried a few different techniques for this, but we settled on making these L brackets out of pink XPS foam, and that worked the best. We glued the brick L's to the corners and then textured them with a rock.
For the inner corners, I decided to mix a batch of Sculpt-A-Mold. So far, I either used plaster or Sculpt-A-Mold depending on the type of gaps I had to fill. As the corners were pretty crappy, I chose Sculpt-A-Mold to fill in the larger gaps. I used my fingers directly as I find I control the results better and it's easier to push it properly in the joints. I decided to also put some along the base of the interior and exterior walls. I used a couple of cotton swabs to clean up the excess of Sculpt-A-Mold that ended up on the floor.
And now we were almost at the painting stage, but first we had to drill holes for our LED wires. We used a wooden dowel to make one of the holes in the inside pillar, and a thick metal straw for the hole in the base. Now, why did we use these tools and not a drill? Well, your guess is as good as mine. We did use a drill, however, for the flooring, because we needed to make the hole big enough for an LED to pass through. So go figure.
The next step was a bit of a science experiment. I made a pitiful attempt at creating a wash for the floors. I used some paint and dish soap trying to follow some tutorials I saw online. I then filled that up with too much water. We had a bottle of Chinese ink I thought would be helpful. I put some ink in the mix, and it did nothing, besides putting a lot of slightly dirty water on the wood. I rated the mix with a higher concentration of paint and ink and less water. When brushing it on the floors, it did a somewhat okay job at staining the planks. But I forgot something crucial: water and wood, especially a lot of water in wood. Wet wood will expand, bend, and twists. So as the top floor were drying, I did have a few planks pop up and fall off the floor. Seeing that, I put less water on the roof, so I had less damage and repairs to do there. I'll say though that it was not the worst, since it's a really run down and ruined building. Crooked planks actually added to the look. I got lucky with this one.
It was finally time for our first floor paint job. Sometimes you absolutely need the right kinds of paints, tools, and materials. But often enough, you can still do a passable job with simple stuff like the dollar store paint. In the case of large XPS foam, that paint was just fine. We started with a gray base coat for the ground floor. Then we moved on to the walls, where we used a cool brick painting technique we saw on NerdForge. In fact, a lot of the medieval building techniques are inspired by some of their videos. So if you somehow don't know who they are, please go and show them some love, because they are legendary crafters. Now, while we were painting the bricks, we were praying that the end result would work, because this technique is counterintuitive. We used a white paint diluted with water to highlight the grooves between the stones and the floor, sort of like grout. And it came out looking pretty good. And it was a fun process to paint because the floor starts to look a lot more realistic as you go.
With the first floor paint job completed, it was time to attach the second floor. I started by gluing the million walls on the floor. Again, I did not have clean-cut corner angles on these walls either, so I had to be creative to mask all the weird gaps. The second floor is not made of stone, they are plastered walls with the awesome woodwork so typical to these buildings. For now, I had to ignore all these crappy joints and keep gluing all the walls. As the walls are visible on both sides, there's no hiding anywhere. But don't worry, I had my plan. Before moving on to the paint job, I needed to test the roof fit one more time to make sure I didn't mess anything up. I don't know why I glued it in place right away. Probably to make my life harder?
A few months in advance, we had purchased some AK Interactive diorama terrains concrete because we knew we wanted to texture the walls for the buildings in the village. The idea here was to use it on the walls to get a weathered plaster look, but as a bonus, it would fill in any gaps in the joints. And we tried hard to paint in one direction to avoid any strange brushstrokes in the walls once it dried. Sometimes it's tough to believe that these builds are going to work out when you've never done them before, because you have no past results to give you confidence, so it's almost like magic when these things work.
I used wood stir sticks and popsicle sticks, and I got a lot more generous with the ink and paint for these ones. I pre-painted most of the pieces, but once in place, I added more paint and ink to adjust the look. I put in matching wooden beams on the inside of the building around the doors and the windows. I look forward to try a build like that again using balsa wood. With the basic paint job and woodwork done, I was able to start weathering. I used diluted black paint to darken the cracks and spaces between the stones on the base. Weathering really takes a project to the next level, and I love doing that. For the walls, I used ink. I was getting less nervous with it, and I only used pure ink diluted in some water with a drop of dish soap. It soaked into the foam a lot. I didn't seal anything with Mod Podge, so the foam was a bit like a sponge. And then, my favorite part, dry brushing. I dry brushed some white all over the base and the floor. It was finally time to pull out the decorative edge scissors as well as a bunch of tissue paper boxes because it was shingles time. We saw a lot of people use cereal boxes to cut shingle strips. I used decorative edge scissors because I wanted to give a fantasy look to the shingles. I cut halfway through the strip at interval of about half an inch and bent every second one. I then glued each strip to the roof and cut them to size. I repeated the process until the entire panel was covered in shingles. The two panels on the outside of the magic shop were more or less intact and had all their shingles. But I only put a few broken shingles on the other side as something really bad happened in the story of the game and many roofs and walls got damaged. Once again, it was time to use our gallon of Mod Podge. I heavily covered the entire roof in Mod Podge. This transformed flimsy cardboard into solid shingles. I highlighted a few tiles with purple to create some variation through the base color. From the get-go, I was locked in on a red roof. I started with a general red base coat all over the shingles. The Mod Podge absolutely worked on this. It was almost like painting wood. There's something super fun about painting with vibrant colors, especially after painting a lot of gray rocks and brown dirt in the rock world and the forest world. But don't worry, there's a lot more to do to bring it all together. I went around the roof a couple of times to make sure the base coat was opaque and there was no brushstroke visible. On the damaged sides, I made sure to leave the wood uncovered and unpainted. And to mute out the red, I used my dry brush and some pink paint. I started by using almost pure China ink to darken and weather the shingles. I was really applying a lot of ink now that I understood how it worked. I did that all around and dabbed the excess with a paper towel. After going heavy with the ink, I finished the whole look by dry brushing some white and yellow. I had in my tool chest these 3M self-adhesive zip tie mount that were perfect for the balcony balustrade. I cut a few zip ties to size, enough to cover both edges of the balcony. I used a couple wooden skewers for rigidity, and once again I made an absolute mess with super glue. I had to sand off the paper that was stuck to the wood and plastic, but once painted, no one will ever know. After a bit of struggle, it worked out exactly as I hoped. To be able to paint it, I needed to prime it. I sprayed it with Citadel Chaos Black primer paint. The funny thing is that as I was building this, my mom was sending me pictures of the real balcony balustrade that she was building at home.
We didn't catch it on camera, but we built an awning above the door of the balcony. Originally, we were trying to be lazy and not make one, but the piece just didn't look right without it. We made a few more shingles to match the rest of the roof and some strips for flashing. We matched the rest of the roof doing the same red paint job and some dry brushing for detail. The next big step for the second floor was woodworking. Now, we forgot to paint the wood pieces before sticking them. I'm not sure why. And maybe it was because we hadn't done this before and we were so focused on the design that we forgot the order of things. Luckily, the plan was to stain the walls with ink to make them look run down and beat up, so we didn't have to be too careful with the wood painting. We used a lot of ink, and then we dabbed it with a paper towel to take some of the excess off. Then we dry brushed it white to give it a faded look, and some highlights to the wooden beams. We honestly just experimented with ink and layers of paint until it looked how we wanted. Sometimes you just gotta mess around and find out.
For the windows, I used fiberglass drywall tape, my super old discontinued Tria markers, and a Sharpie marker. A big shout out to the Black Magic Craft channel for his tutorial on windows. Without a laser cutter or a 3D printer, I was not sure how to make window lattices. I cut some plastic packaging and clear acetate sheets to fit the window size. To color the windows, I used my Tria markers to blend some translucent oranges and yellows. This worked so well, I repeated the process for all the windows on the second floor. I simply tacked the window with a bit of glue on each corner and pasted them on the inside walls. And I said to use the low temperature on the glue gun to stick foam, right? I didn't notice, but it was on high. You cannot see it so well on camera, but the walls were smoking and melting away. I got a bit rattled by the melting walls, so I won't say too loud, but I ended up gluing the second floor a bit offset from where it was supposed to be. I know. I finished the inside of the second floor with the missing woodwork and covering up the edges of the acetate windows. As an interesting choice, I did not make window panes for the first floor and also skipped the door. Why? I think because the clock was ticking and we were only 3 months away from Christmas and we still had 5 massive dioramas to make, including a castle and a video game to finish programming. I would love to go back at some point and add them. I finally made it to my first prop production session. I was really looking forward to this. I had some stuff in my scrapbooking kit, but I also went around the house and tried to find junk and trinkets I could use. I frayed a fabric sticker to make a rug by pulling some strands, and it looks pretty nice on the second floor. The main item that needed to be on the counter was the gem that would light up once the quest would be completed. I used some trinkets and I made a holder for it. I used a couple of scrapbooking accessories as picture wall frames. They were easy to install, I just needed to push the pin in the foam. A magic shop is not a magic shop without some stones and crystals. I used tongue depressors and skewers to create a small box set where the lizard men could display a variety of stones. I never thought I'd be using so many skewers and stir sticks. Once the main frame was completed, I put in a couple dividers to create 3 compartments. From my art supply kit, I found beads that could masquerade as magic crystals. Now the adventurers can buy magic crystals to complete their quest. From the dollar store, we got this wire jute twine. I coiled it on itself to create a couple of baskets. I made one to hold some scrolls by the counter and another one to put on the second floor to hold extra supplies. You could also see it as a big pile of ropes. Your call. We got a block of wet floral foam which turned out to be handy to make bags. I used white sports tape because it was a fabric texture and adhesive. I placed a cube of floral foam in some tape that I folded on itself to shape as a bag. I tried a few different techniques to fold the tape, and I don't recall which one works best because I did each one differently. And I tied a string around the opening of the bag. There you go. I used a hand drill to create a guiding hole in the counter to push the LED through. And I used a larger drill bit to delicately make the hole larger.
We used our pack of pre-wired 12-volt LEDs to test the gem. Originally, we just touched the wires to a 9-volt battery. These LEDs have a resistor wired, so it's okay to use a 9-volt battery. Gems are a major story point in this game, and as we mentioned in previous videos, we purchased a bag of plastic gems on Amazon. The initial test was just pushing the LED onto the counter and connecting it to the battery. We used a pink gem for this test, but it was just a placeholder until the story for this world was finished. We'd pick a color based on what made the most sense after that. To give the impression of a well-stocked shop, we took some mini wooden blocks and painted them. We weathered them with a mix of diluted paint and China ink. Then we used a fine-tip ink pen to draw a crate pattern on the weathered cubes. To add some variety, we made a series of scrolls for the magic shop by soaking some paper strips in water and brown paint. We let them dry out and then rolled them up into scrolls. The magic shop is one of the central points in the village, and it's run by a lizard wizard. But he didn't always used to be a wizard, or a lizard. He was once a normal human who worked the forge as a blacksmith. But everything changed the day the professor came. He offered to teach the blacksmith magic and help him get his work done. It really seemed the professor was helping the village, but he was really just helping himself. Once the professor had everything he needed to open a portal and leave, he did. And this caused a massive disaster, destroying the town and everyone in it. Everyone except those with magic. The blacksmith transformed and became a lizard man. Since then, he spent all of his time learning magic and trying to set things right. This diorama turned out to be one of the best in the entire game. We're so proud of it. Thanks for watching. This video is just one in a big series. There are more to come, and feel free to check out the previous videos. Like and subscribe to support the channel.